Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few dollars in your wallet. Well, it has been a while since we have done a podcast, and it was really nice for me to take some time off to do a few different things. One of which is do a lot of research into history and our financial markets and where things are at. And not a lot has changed since our last episode 6 weeks ago or so, except for one thing has significantly changed. And that is we've really started into what I'm predicting is going to be a Great Depression. Probably as bad, if not worse, than the one previously covered in the United States in the 1930s. And the reason that I say this is because governments are not allowing free markets to be free. And in fact, they're doing quite the opposite thing. They're interjecting themselves more and more, creating more risk, more bubbles, more inflation, all sorts of more problems. And this is unfortunately just the beginning. So in our first COVID podcast, one of the first things I said was, this is just the beginning of this. And one of the first tweets back was, or comments back was, fake news. And unfortunately, this is not fake news. We are in the middle of both a pandemic, and we are also in the middle of a true financial reckoning. And now that the government spending for both the CARES Act in terms of businesses getting money to retain employees and people getting extra $600 unemployment, now that's ended. Trump has come out and pushing out $300 a month from the Fed, asking states that are broke to chip in an extra 100, which I haven't heard of any states saying, yes, we're going to chip in that extra 100, because none of them have it. We're really just beginning into this. So despite many of the things that are being said out there in terms of the property market's really hot right now. Yep, agreed. Two factors in that. One, the Fed lowering interest rates to basically zero creates a huge value for current property owners and buyers, because that's equivocally a price discount. So if you go from a rate of 4% to 2%, you give people potentially 10 to 20% additional buying power. That's huge. In addition to, people want out of cities. If you're not going to have to work in a city and there's nothing to go do in the city because it's all shut down, it makes it pretty hard to want to live in a city. And this is going to be a very interesting dynamic as it plays out, because potentially the flight back into cities may not happen anytime soon. It's very possible cities start becoming ghost towny-ish, or who knows. It's very interesting to see how this is going to play out. So there's certain things in the economy that don't necessarily make sense right now. But most of them, if you look at why people are moving to certain places, and if we remember that real estate is also localized. So I believe the other data point that I saw this week was that the borrowers with less than 20% down, and these are all FHA borrowers, I believe their amount of payments in default is at the highest ever. So kind of two sides of this that we're seeing right now is, in some places things look like they're okay and better from some pent up demand and people wanting more space and out of cities. And then on the other side, to see a lot of people hurting and with no jobs and less in benefits. Or in a lot of communities where you've got a lot of immigrant workers, potentially it's even worse because there's no jobs for them because businesses are literally just shut down. So let's get into some of the data that we're going to see. So what I believe is, and again, this is a financial education podcast. This is not a what you should do with your money recommendations. In fact, when I started it, I wanted to be specifically different in that respect. I am not selling any financial products. I'm not even recommending any financial products. I'm recommending financial education, and that's what this is. So if anything that I say during the course of this you think means that you should go do something, you're wrong. I'm not telling you to do anything except for educate yourself and make your own investment decisions. But here's what I believe. Inflation is coming. And why do I believe inflation is coming? Well, the government magically printed $3 trillion inside of about 3 weeks. So also bond yields are giving retired people no income. When you look at the two of those combined, and what's likely to continue to happen is that we will see inflation. They want inflation. They're talking about it constantly. And not only is the Federal Reserve talking about it, but what they're also saying is that when inflation comes, we're not going to raise interest rates anytime soon. And reducing interest rates is also a way of taking away from savers to begin with, because there's no yield. And this is one of the reasons the stock market's been run up. And if you don't think the stock market's overvalued, ask somebody who knows. That's all today's news was about. And another interesting side piece of news that I just pulled up and was looking at is that this is the fastest recovery in the stock market that we've ever had. So the stock market dropped almost 30%, and it is now back to all-time record highs within 6 months while we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So this makes absolutely no sense. It just doesn't. Everyone's saying, oh, well, we'll get past this and the future will be brighter. But that doesn't take into account all of the debt that's in the system. And that's not just, I'm not talking just about the federal government's debt. I'm talking about the federal government's debt, businesses in debt, individuals in debt, and not just the U.S. economy. The China economy has deep amounts of debt. The European economy has way, way, way too much debt. Both, again, citizens, local and state governments, federal governments, all of it. Systemically, there's just so much debt. We have all, in a sense, lived beyond our means for so long that sooner or later, you have to pay the bill. Austerity has to come. And I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So by whatever metric you want to run the stock market as, they say the Warren Buffett method is divide the stock market by GDP, or another way is to look at it versus price to earnings. And whatever way you're looking at it, the stock market is the most overvalued it has ever been. And you go, okay, well, why is that? Well, the truth of that is because the Federal Reserve keeps pumping money into it. Again, when you make bonds worth 1%, I'm going to give you my money for 10 years and you're going to give me 1%. I'm not going to do that. So people are chasing return. So they're going to move that money to stocks. While they're higher risk, they're higher return. And that people are looking for yield in absolute terms and actually getting some money back. So there's speculation going on everywhere, and it's kind of frightening. But it's the world we're living in right now, so what do we do about it? Well, we can talk about your money then. We can talk about what's the smart money. So your unemployment benefits were $600 a week. Now those dropped to $300, and that's only for people that were getting at least $100 in benefits, which I'm fascinated. So far, for what I've read, 12 states have signed on for this. And Colorado's included in that, which is interesting. I figured they would be because they're not going to say no to government money. So the question I have is, how many people are currently eligible for less than that $100 a month threshold? And this is actually why it's going to delay Colorado in rolling out this extra $300 to everybody. But that makes you think about this, and you go, okay, so for the last 4 months, if you were supposed to get $100 a week in unemployment benefits because you were working part-time somewhere, all of a sudden you got $700 a week. So if your benefits were supposed to be $400 a month, they went to $2,800 a month. So of course, savings rates went up a little bit. Of course, some people's credit cards got paid off because the Fed printed money and threw it all over the place. It doesn't make sense to give somebody whose unemployment benefit was $100 a week, $700 a week instead. That doesn't make any sense at all. And in fact, incentivizes workers not to go back to work, which for those who decided they weren't going to go back to work, they're going to be really disappointed now when they want to go back to work and there's no job left because quarantine has made all these businesses close. And that's going to continue for a while too. So what's next on our list? We got a lot of things to cover today. As I already said, the stock market doesn't care about any of it. It's just reached an all-time high, the fastest it's ever gotten there off of a bear market dip. Literally, the bear market lasted for 16 days, and then the Federal Reserve printed enough money to say, we're going to take the stock market to all-time highs. So last week, the week of August that ended, hold on, I'm going to look up the dates right here, so we're speaking the same thing. The week that ended August 13th, they said unemployment finally came in below 1 million. Now, that would have been an all-time high, under 1 million, if it wasn't for the last couple of months. But now all of a sudden, under 1 million was great. Well, this week, the numbers just came out, and it was over 1 million again in new claims. And while they're telling us the unemployment rate is 10%, the reality is almost 35 million people are getting unemployment benefits in some way, shape, or form. So those numbers don't line up. But that's because they don't want to take all the previously self-employed people that are on unemployment or whatever jobs that they had. They don't want to take everybody. Well, if you're not going to count the people who are currently getting paid on unemployment, then our statistics almost don't matter anymore. And on the next podcast, I'm going to talk about some government statistics regarding inflation that really make no sense, that they really manipulate. And that's a real problem for us in trying to understand what the hell is going on. Obviously, the government's shown it can't function. It can't agree on anything. This is why we end up with Trump saying there's $300 in unemployment benefits, which probably will last for about 6 weeks, versus Congress getting its act together and actually deciding what it should be. Now, granted, I'm almost skewed 100% towards libertarian at this point and free markets. However, I do believe in a situation like this where you have a pandemic, it is appropriate for the government to help certain people. I don't believe what the government has done in its full approach of refund all the markets and nothing fails, and because we're going to end up with all these crazy zombie companies that keep lasting forever because they have cheap debt. Meanwhile, they're unproductive. And the big part that's going to be missing that is essential to a free market is creative destruction. Where's all the things getting destroyed? The only thing that I see getting destroyed are legitimate businesses who would have been fine if it wasn't for actual government action. So governments are shutting down businesses, not creating them. Meanwhile, they're creating massive debts. So this doesn't make any sense to me. It's very irritating. And the other thing is evictions were able to begin in July. So before there was a moratorium on evictions. So here's the difference, though. If you're a renter, you get kicked out. If you've got a mortgage, you get to defer that mortgage. And in fact, if you still have a job and you've deferred your mortgage, your cash flow just got a lot better, which also goes to why there's more money chasing in the stock market. So there's a lot of different issues here that different people get to deal with, right? On the one hand, if you're an owner of a home who can't make your payment, you get to tack those payments on to the end of your loan, and you have more cash in your pocket today because you're not making mortgage payments. Versus if you rent, you have no mortgage to tack on to the end of it, and now you're getting kicked out. Which way is it? We're going sideways, two different directions at the same time. None of this makes any sense. So obviously our government can't get it together. They've gotten control over way too many things, and they're going to use this as an excuse to get control over a lot more things. And that's actually a big concern of mine. How many million unemployed and counting? So again, we had the first week under 1 million, but the week right after, right back over 1 million. All of those would have been a record if we were talking about any time before 2020. But all of a sudden, it doesn't make any sense that we're saying that these jobs are going to come back quickly. They're not. And the longer people are laid off, the more their skills deteriorate and the more incentives companies have to automate. And you got other systemic problems going on right now because of COVID, which means that fewer and fewer people are going to start businesses, especially brick and mortar businesses, especially things like yoga studios and restaurants. that can be shut down, where all of a sudden the government decides your patrons aren't allowed to show up and give you any money. Or they can reduce the size that you're operational, 50% or 25%. And they can change the rules every day, which is exactly what they're doing. And so here's a scary, scary stat that I saw this week, that 31% of workers who are brought back to work have now been laid off again. Now, I think a large portion of those were probably brought back because of the CARES Act, where all of a sudden businesses got money to make payroll. And if they use the money for payroll, at least a certain percentage of it, then they could use the rest of it to pay rent and utilities and other bills. Now, I will still do a podcast on how to get your loans repaid. However, the SBA isn't prepared to take forms yet, so that's at least another month out. But I will come back with that presentation. Most people are going to be able to get all their loans forgiven unless you're a business with multiple employees where you didn't bring any back, then you got different issues. But if you're self-employed and just got money, they basically moved it to 24 weeks, you're going to get all that forgiven. It's still taxable income, but it's still free money. Sort of free, because all of us taxpayers are going to pay for it. So we've got 15 million people on regular state unemployment benefits. We got an additional at least 10 million on self-employed that we're not counting into our official 10% rate. So what's the real rate of unemployment? And what are the number of people who aren't even looking for jobs now? Because if you're not looking, they don't count you. And my guess is we're in the somewhere around 20 to 25%. I'm going to guess right in the middle of that. Probably we're at 22% unemployment is my guess. Now with lowered benefits, and no way to not get evicted. So there is a lot more harm coming at the bottom of the income stream, as always. I've talked about this multiple times. Lowering interest rates does not help those people. It does not. But this is the thing. The government's only in charge of a few things. So handing out money, one of those things. Because of government policies, businesses continue to fail and declare bankruptcy. There's a lot more barely holding on. It's really hard to be in the restaurant business right now. It's almost impossible to have a yoga studio or a gym. And there's plenty of other businesses. Anything that requires social distancing that does not fit with your business model right now is out. And we see retailers closing pretty much weekly. I mean, it's just to pick which ones you want to throw on the filed for bankruptcy this weekend, whether it's a J. Crew, a J.C. Penney's, the list just keeps going on and on and on. Brooks Brothers is in bankruptcy. So's Joseph A. Bank, which is part of Men's Warehouse. That's all in bankruptcy. I mean, they just continue and continue. Steinmart this week, they're out. Or maybe that was last week. Again, there's so many every week that, they're continuing to go. The next big piece we've got coming, especially because the governments can't agree, is the state and local layoffs. Because most states and local governments, thank goodness, are required to balance their budgets, they're going to start laying people off. Airline money runs out, so those people are going to get laid off. So the reason that I'm calling for a depression is not because of what the stock market's doing, it's because what reality is happening in our communities. The amount of people who are out of work, the amount of business owners that are being forced out of their business of no fault of their own. And I don't think those businesses are going to be replaced anytime soon. In addition to that, we have, on the one hand, we have protests, which are fine. I have no problem and support the protests 100%. But then we've got the looting, which is just causing chaos. And I think these are people, for the most part, just looking as an excuse. And also, as the economy gets worse, there's going to be more and more and more of this. Now, if we want to talk about the government and their pandemic response, I've been saying this from the beginning. In the beginning, it was flatten the curve. Well, flatten the curve means we all get sick. And in my opinion, this is still the reality of the situation. Everyone's just kind of ignoring it under this idea that we're going to develop a vaccine and the vaccine's going to be effective. But vaccines aren't 100% effective. We don't know if this virus will mutate like the flu does already. There's a reason there's a flu shot every year, because the virus mutates. We don't know if coronavirus will mutate or not. So flatten the curve meant that eventually we were all going to get sick. And the only way past this was herd immunity. And make no mistake, this is not Spanish flu type incidents where we're going to lose 50 million people in the world, right? The U.S. so far, I think the statistics through this week were at about 180,000 people dead. Well, here's what they don't put you. And I'm gonna pick on the New York Times right now because the New York Times puts it. I pull up their app on my iPad and it shows me how many tests, how many people, how many deaths. How many people have COVID and how many people have died? Well, if they're going to put up how many people have died from COVID, then in my opinion, they should take at least the top 10 things that people die from and put those up there every day too so people have some kind of perspective. Because last year, or maybe it's 2018, and maybe it's not last year, but it's the last year the CDC has records for. And I believe it's 2018 data, it might be 2019, can't remember off the top of my head. 2.8 million Americans died. Okay? So this is right down here on the end. 2.8 people in the U.S. die every single year. That is almost 7,800 people die every single day. So when they say the coronavirus itself has killed 180,000 people, first of all, we need to dive into those stats. Okay. How many of those people were already sick? And I don't want to mean to sound like I'm unempathetic or I don't care about that people die, but here's the reality, folks. We're all going to die. You're going to die. I'm going to die. It's one of the guarantees you have on this planet. Living in the United States, you've got two, death and taxes. And taxes, they're going to take a lot of different ways. So I promise you're going to pay those. And I promise you're going to die. We're all going to meet our end. That is the guarantee. It's what makes life actually precious. Okay, so if we know that, and we know that we have a life expectancy, in the U.S., let's say it's 77 years old. If I'm older than that, then it doesn't matter what kills me. We shouldn't label it. We shouldn't be like, hey, the guy was 90 years old. He died from heart disease. How about he died from being 90? And most people don't live to 90. He died of old age. In old age, what will kill you? What is the straw that finally sends you to your grave? Is not necessarily really what even killed you. Oh, he died from heart disease. Because he was 90? That sounds like you're dying from old age. Right? So when older people die, we should say they die from old age. But this year, no older people have died from anything, it seems like, except for coronavirus. If we're going to publish statistics and we're going to tell people how many people are dying and scare the shit out of everybody with how many people are dead, coronavirus got 180,000 people. Well, why aren't we telling people that, oh yeah, by the way, 400,000 people died last year from heart attacks? How many more people are going to be stressed and die this year from heart attacks than there are from coronavirus? Well, if the same number of people die this year as they died last year from heart attacks, then more people are going to die from heart attacks from coronavirus. So if more people are dying from heart attacks, then we need to stop selling anything and everything that could possibly lead to heart disease, which means there's nothing left on the shelves to buy because we're trying to prevent all heart diseases. 180,000 people is not that many. Right? If we consider that almost 8,000 people die per day, we're talking about 20 days worth of deaths or coronavirus inside of 6 months. So, okay, you get 40 for the year. Now, how many people are not going to die from other things? They need to be telling us how many more people than the 2.8 million people that would have died this year anyway are going to die this year. Because a lot of those people who died from coronavirus this year probably would have died from something else. This is the part they're not sharing with us. This is the part that's nonsense, that doesn't make any sense. So if we're going to flatten the curve, but that still means we all get sick just over a longer period of time so the hospitals don't get filled up. But we're not doing any studies on viral load, i.e. how much dose we could give somebody so they're likely not to get sick but get enough that they get some antibodies. No, we're going 100% on the vaccine route, even though we don't know that if we give people a vaccine, that'll actually work. Usually they're about 70% effective, which means that 30% of people got a vaccine won't be protected anyway. So that's not like we're getting where we need to be. And then if the virus mutates, or if, like they say, and nobody knows right now, but apparently you could get the virus again. So if that happens, then what are we supposed to get vaccinated all the time, but still 30% of the people could still get it at any time because it's not effective for them? And what's the long-term consequences of this vaccine? We don't know. So it looks like coronavirus is going to be here with us to stay for a while. So if you got my vote right now of stay at home until we develop a vaccine, continue to have businesses go out of business, continue to have kids lose out on education, which is forever going to impact them as they fall behind, as though the U.S. isn't already far enough behind because of our politicalization of schools and our schools not teaching what should be taught, instead teaching what some silly school board decides, none of which those people are required to actually know what's going on or teach anything useful. We've got college campuses are shut down. We've got restaurants that'll never open again, offices that are staying empty, commercial property market's probably going to collapse, and we're just going to keep paying everybody to not work? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Government cannot fix this unto itself. This isn't the Spanish flu going to kill 50 million people. All right, this is going to kill a couple million people in the world. We're going to have to live with that, just like we live with 2.8 million people in the U.S. dying every year. And if we look at the healthy people that are dying, it's a very small percentage. So if you're unhealthy, you should be concerned, not just from coronavirus, but every day that you're not healthy. And you should do something about it. But we're not talking about what we can do to be healthier. We're not talking about vitamin D and things you can do to actually prevent yourself from getting sick and boost your immune system. We're not talking about doing breathing exercises and meditating so that you have a stronger immune system. Why aren't we talking about these things? These are things that matter, that actually fix people. So that's my pitch on the virus for now. I'm just going to move on because otherwise I'm just going to get irritated. So unfortunately, I know this is bad news, and I'm trying to get it through it quickly so we can just talk about potentially what we can do for ourselves. But, this is the reality of the world that we're in and what's going to happen. And my job in trying to educate people is to help you understand cycles. And the cycle that I want everyone to understand that's not happening is we have no free market cycle. No longer do I believe is there any true capitalism happening in the United States. We're going to call it that. It's going to get blamed for everything. But we don't have it and haven't had it for a while. And I'll tell you why I know this. Because the Federal Reserve intervening in all of the markets means it's not a free market. That's not a free market. The government's controlling it. It did in 2008 and didn't let the banks fail. Should have let them fail. Now, too big to fail means you're just too damn big, and we only have 4 when we used to have 20. And before we had 20, we had 80. But we let them condense because we're not very smart. And we're going to do the same things over and over again. Now businesses that are so big, they dump tons of money into political campaigns. And we're about to get to see all the ads from all of that contribution from all the companies. And they're going to contribute to both sides. So no matter who wins, they got favors happening in the White House. And guess what's happening right now in our economy that is being manipulated? The bigger companies are getting even bigger. It's why you see Google and Facebook and Amazon stock prices all going through the roof. Why? Why are they getting bigger? Because government's making it easier for them to get bigger. They're making money cheaper for them to borrow. They're letting them borrow more amounts at lower rates, right? And they're killing their competitors. Every store that goes out of business, that's good news for Amazon. Bad news for the consumer. I look at where we have to shop for groceries these days. Okay, who do you got left? You can go to Walmart, Costco, Kroger, which owns King Soopers as well as Kroger stores, or you have basically Safeway and Albertsons. Now, there's a few others on the side, on the periphery. For example, like what are a couple of the other ones? They're on the tip of my tongue. You have some Sprouts, some natural grocer type places, some smaller places, but those are smaller. In general, we now have 4 big ones. They control like 85% of the food market. That's crazy. And a lot of these things are being shown in our supply chains where we've done the same thing, where we have a shortage of meat because we have a shortage of meat packing plants because of consolidation. We think this consolidation is good, but it's really, really bad. And it's happening in almost every industry. That is not free markets. That is not capitalism. The biggest part of capitalism that's being destroyed right now is the most important part. And that is destruction. We need destruction. Creative destruction is how things get reborn. Think about it this way. You own a building, and let's say it's a commercial building, and you rent it out, and businesses go out, they use that building as their warehouse and as their office buildings, and they go out and they make profits. And then one day, your building gets burnt to the ground. And instead of somebody coming in and wiping away the ashes of that thing and building a new building that can then go be productive, instead of doing that, what do we do instead? We go, oh, well, here's the money for it, and then the building just sits there, burnt out for decades to come. That burnout building is what we're creating in zombie companies. It's not making money anymore. It's just slowly losing money every year. And that money and those assets are not then repurposed. That building's not knocked down. A new one is built that therefore businesses can go in and again do productive things in that increase the value of the building, increase taxes for the city, provide jobs for people, and create value for the business owners. All of those things are correlated. They all go together. But we're killing the creative destruction part because we're keeping everybody alive, except for actually the businesses that we're literally destroying. The restaurants and the yoga studios that are already shut down. The small businesses that just aren't going to be able to make it because they need customers. And when your customer is told it has to stay at home, it's hard to do business. So this is just the way cycles go. But I want to talk about the manipulation and that we don't have free markets. This is not capitalism. I'm all about free markets and a small government. And we're going to end up with the exact opposite. We're going to end up with consolidated markets and bigger government and more control. And that's what I want you to know and understand and do things you can to help your family get through this. So we talked about evictions at the beginning. So now what's the echo effect of the beginning? Well, more layoffs are coming. So that means more people are going to be evicted. So that's more people that cannot afford to make their car payments or rent payments. That's more evictions and repossessions. And all of those were on hold for a while, but not anymore. Now it's full steam ahead. But here's the problem. It's a cycle. So right now, people are moving out of cities, helping a housing market. But when the evictions really keep going, that means more empty apartments. That means landlords are going to reduce rent. And if you don't think that's happening already, talk to landlords in San Francisco and New York City and ask them if rent prices are dropping, because they are. They're already dropping. So that means as landlords start dropping their price and they're getting less money for their rentals, that means the real estate taxes the city's going to get are going to be less. It's somewhat good for the new people coming in, but if you're trying to sell your apartment in New York City, well, guess what? The value of it's being driven down because you can now rent for cheaper and cheaper. And I expect this cycle is going to continue as more people get laid off, more people got to move in together. You're going to see a higher density into apartments and houses. And it's not like we don't see this in certain communities already. In certain communities, especially immigrant communities, you'll see 10 or 12 people living in one house. That was commonplace in America up until probably 100 years ago. I dated a girl once who grew up on a farm in Kansas where they literally had one building, like 1,000 square foot was their entire house. And they would basically pull the beds down at night and everyone slept on the floor or, on a bed that pulled down. And then during the day, everything went up and you pulled the tables back out. And now it became the dining room and the kitchen. And that was that. And everybody slept in one room. And that was commonplace in America. So this idea that we have a shortage of housing in America is only based on the idea that we all want to live in separate places. If we moved back in with if you had grandparents, parents, and kids all living in the same household all the time in America, we'd need a lot less housing. So it's very possible that on the long term housing prices fall. But also realize, when I'm talking about housing prices, we're talking about the general. And the general doesn't necessarily make any sense because real estate markets are specifically located in are specific to the area. So, for example, real estate prices are going to fall a lot bigger in Vegas, where it's a lot harder to get economic activity started back up because the main industry is gambling and tourism when no one's doing any gambling or tourism, or gambling can be done online, so they don't need a building, and tourism's way down. So property values in Las Vegas are going to drop a whole lot faster than they are, let's say, in the suburbs around San Francisco, where people want to live, where they still have access to the city. And I expect that's going to continue. And especially as companies figure out how people work from home, they're going to work from home more. So that's what's going to happen. And things will change. So in the car market, we're going to see the same thing. Repossessions are going to increase. That means more cars are going to be for sale. Then more repossessions will happen as more people get laid off. So the same thing as rent. Now people moving from cities gave a short-term boost to car buying because people didn't have cars. Now repossessions will increase. More cars will be available. I thought that all the Hertz cars were going to hit the market, but it seems like the banks or the courts are more likely to steal money from the bondholders and not make them sell those cars, even though Hertz should just fail and we should get some smaller car companies that actually make money. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Depressions and recessions disproportionately affect poor people, and this one will be no exception to that rule. As I said earlier, homeowners can defer payments to the end of their mortgage. Renters can't do this. So renters get evicted. But again, this creative destruction, there's plenty of homeowners who can't make their payments and probably should get foreclosed on, but they're going to get extended. And that's preventing, again, those assets from being reused in the economy. Now, will that save some people and help them who get their jobs back? Yes, it will. But in large part, this is the reason I'm going to say we're going to have a depression, not a recession, is because it's going to take a lot longer for all of these assets to go through the market, because the government's not going to allow for the creative destruction to happen quickly. So it's going to be prolonged and drawn out, which is going to make this worse for everybody. And that's just kind of what governments do. So anyone who listens to my podcast regularly knows that we're going to talk about consumer debt. And consumer debt was in large part one of the things that's causing all of this, because if you look at it from a household perspective, then if your husband and your wife and you guys make $3,000 a month, but you're spending $4,000 a month, then that extra $1,000 you're borrowing from somebody. So whether you're borrowing it on credit cards or you're borrowing it from the bank in different ways, or you're taking out a home equity line of credit on your house and using that money to pay the difference, whatever it is, when you're living beyond your means, you're making payments of your future money. And this is what America's done. And this is why this recession is not just about COVID. It is about total debt. So total debt is still just under the highest it's ever been. So this is just consumer debt. So we still have corporate debt, and we still have federal debt, as well as state and local debt, and also state and local promises and federal promises for all of the benefits they're going to provide to an aging generation, the baby boomers, that is just beginning to retire. And that's going to make it, that's another huge headwind against, this growth in our economy. It's going to grow from who? All the retirees who are not working anymore? That's not growth. It's the opposite, a shrink. So what was really wild about watching Q2 and watching federal stimulus is that as they gave out more money to people on unemployment than they potentially ever made in their lives, but certainly more money than they were making at their job, delinquency rates dropped, even though 25 million people were unemployed, and credit card balances went down. And you could view that as the Federal Reserve printing money to give to people who then give to banks. So you could view it as, well, if those people didn't get extra supplemental benefits and a $1,200 check from the government, then they might have not been able to pay that debt back, not been able to make that credit card payment. So they might have gone into bankruptcy, and the banks would have taken those losses. Instead, the government printed money, got handed to banks, less losses for the banks. We see who wins in these things all the time. Here's the mismatch part of that. If debt's going up and delinquency rates are dropping, then credit, you would think, would be loosening because, hey, people are paying off their debts better, which means there's less risk, which means we can loan out more money. But the opposite happened. While delinquency rates dropped, credit got tighter. which means that nobody wants to lend money to people. So now if you want to get a loan, you have to have a really good credit score or your interest rates jump higher and higher and higher. And this started before the crisis happened, before the coronavirus hit, which means that this was not necessarily driven by the coronavirus. It's driven by this $14 trillion in debt. And I just read something the other day about the property market, specifically in Colorado, and they said based off of incomes, the property market has to go down because there's not enough income for people to make these mortgage payments. And this is what happens with debt. So if you're living beyond your means, at some point you get to where you're stuck, where every dollar you make is already spoken for stuff that you got before. So if you buy a house and you fill it up with all sorts of things that you've bought, but then you have to make payments for all of those things, at some point, if you just keep buying stuff, all of your paycheck goes to pay for things. And I know there's a bunch of people in these situations where they're living paycheck to paycheck, there's nothing being saved, and all of their money goes to just living and then debt service. And that's the debt trap, right, that you get stuck in. And it's really hard to get out of. But the easiest way out is you have to reduce your spending, right? Or you have to sell some things, right? Well, that doesn't work for a government. They don't want to do any of that, so they're not gonna. So we go the other way. We go, hey, instead we're going to let people not make their payments. So everyone got to extend their credit card payments. Everyone got to extend their car payments. Everyone got to extend their mortgage loans. I read a really fascinating article, and I think I talked about it on the last podcast, which was that the repo guy had nothing to do. Well, now I think he's going to be really damn busy because all those extensions are running out and the unemployment rate's still high. So those who own get a defer. Those who don't own don't get a defer. And that's going to create a bigger and bigger wealth gap inequality, even though we're expecting the opposite. And low interest rates only help those who have homes already and who still have jobs. So while the foreclosures have been deferred, the renter evictions start. And that's the beginning of our depression. Because jobs are not going to return anytime soon. So here's the problem with jobs returning. Schools. So if schools are open and daycare is available, then a lot of people can go to work. But there's a lot of single parent households who are responsible for children. How are they supposed to go work full-time and play school teacher full-time and the kid be home? So universities are expecting less than 25% of students in classrooms for fall 2020. There's a huge discussion, as there should be, about the value proposition of studying online. Now, there should be a huge discussion of just the value proposition of college degrees in general, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. I'm going to stick to just this. Kids aren't in classrooms, which means a lot of them aren't on campus, which means a lot of them aren't spending all of that money. Now, granted, some of that money shouldn't be spent. I'll argue for that all day, but it's still a huge supply shock to the entire system. Flights. I was just on one. Finally flew for my first time. I believe it's pretty low risk, but it's going to be a long time before everyone's flying around when they're scared of actually dying. The real risk, if you're under 55, is pretty damn low from this virus. Now, we don't know some of the long-term potential consequences of it. That's a potential reality, of course, of anything. Go, check out Lyme disease and see what the long-term consequences of that are, but we don't have everybody stuck inside for fear of getting bit by a tick. But the long-term consequences are potentially the same as COVID, if not worse. But if you're over 55, the risk is real. And therefore, those people aren't going to be back to travel anytime soon. And since that's a huge segment of the market population in the U.S., that's a problem. And we're about to see this as airlines start cutting everybody when their federal money, our tax money, goes away. Social distancing. We don't know how long we're going to deal with it, but companies know we're going to deal with it for a while. So automation's going to spike. Social distancing, people can't come to work because their kids are out of school, or because they're sick, or because they got exposed to somebody who was sick, all sorts of reasons. And because wages are rising because of COVID, because it's harder to find people because unemployment was paying more. Now, I think that's going to reverse, but there's also people feeling like they're at risk of their life while going to work, which is... if you're in a crab boat, that's a normal thing. If you fly in that water, you're going to be dead in 5 minutes. But for the rest of us, we don't think that being a cashier at Home Depot is high risk. But in today's world, it is. And so people are going to want to be paid for that risk. And therefore, companies will look to automate even more. Here's the biggest problem that I see, the biggest headwind. Who's going to start a business right now to replace the businesses that are closing? Now, if you're talking about an online business that you can do everything from your house, sure. But that's not replacing the brick and mortar businesses that are going under. That's not replacing the restaurants that are going to be gone. It's not. I'm fascinated to see if there's going to be a yoga studio that I can go to when this thing's over, or if they've all shut down because of social distancing. I don't know what the answer to that is. And I know that I'm not going to be in an extreme hurry to go start one or invest in one. Or if I'm a bank, I'm not going to be in a hurry to loan money to one, because what's your pandemic response? What is your business going to do if the government shuts you down again? And that's going to make it really hard to loan. And remember what I just said, credit standards are already tightening. What about starting business money? That's going to be tough to come back from. Food trucks are probably the real only rational plan. Without that, you got to go to a bank and have a pandemic plan on top of already just running a business, which is already hard enough to do. I just don't see tons of businesses opening anytime soon. In addition, banks very reluctant to loan out money. So part 2 of this becomes not only are private businesses laying people off, but state and local governments start laying everybody off. Because they're getting less in sales tax. They're getting less in income tax. They're going to get less in property taxes as property values drop, especially on commercial property. So here's the scariest thing. In the government intervening, here's what they've done. And the real interest rates on U.S. Treasuries are negative. And here's what I'm saying. So technically, a 10-year U.S. Treasury is paying about 0.7% interest. That is what's known as the nominal rate. Okay? So what's the real rate of return? I.e., if I give the government my money for 10 years and I get 0.7% interest every year, okay, then in 10 years, I get my money back plus that interest. But what's the buying power of that money in 10 years? And if the buying power year over year, if inflation is more than 0.7% interest, I'm giving the government my money and I'm losing money on this bet. Okay, so if inflation is, let's just say 5%, but I'm getting 0.7% interest, then let's just say this was a 1-year treasury that paid, for easy math, let's say it's a 1-year treasury that pays 1% interest. But inflation's 5%. So I give you $1,000, and in a year you give me back $1,010. But now what can I buy with that $1,010? Not the same thing I could have bought with $1,000 a year ago. Now, if the same thing that cost me $1,000 a year ago, it cost me $1,050. So I've lost 4% or $40 in this case of buying power in 1 year. That's effectively giving somebody that percentage of money. Now, usually when you give somebody some of your money, when you get it back, you want more buying power, not less. And so this hurts savers. So if you are a saver, you need to understand that the world just changed. The world just changed from you, the saver, being paid for your money to them stealing it from you by giving you a very low interest rate and running up inflation. And they've already told you, the Treasury has already said, we want inflation to happen. We want to create it. Now, in the short term, they may do the opposite because we may have a real recession. And in that case, there'll probably be a lot of deflationary pressures, especially as markets sell off. Now, their idea that they lower interest rates and that helps prevent deflation because now if I go to buy a property, for example, if I'm going to buy a home right now and the interest rate's 2% instead of 4%, I can afford a lot more home. So if with the government dropping treasuries to basically negative, how are you going to invest your money? Not in treasuries, because you're getting, as I just said, you're getting back less buying power than what you had before. So that's a silly bet. That's very, very bad. But this isn't going to stop. So while this is good for refinancing, and if you're taking out debt, it's very bad for savers and investors. Meanwhile, the government's printing more money than it's ever printed. The deficits continue to increase, which means what? That our long-term burden, the same thing that goes for that family. At some point, you can't borrow any more money. Right? And so what are your options? You basically have three options. You can declare bankruptcy, start over. There's a problem, though, when you're the world's Federal Reserve currency, or when you're the world's reserve currency, which happens to be that our federal currency is. If the government declared insolvency, all the banks in the world basically would become bankrupt because an asset that they believed they were getting 100% of their money back on, they're getting zero. And to take those losses would bankrupt the entire system. So they can't do that. So that's your first option, is default. Your second option is austerity. So if you're a household, instead of spending $4,000 a month when you make $3,000, you've got to spend $2,500. You've got to spend less. And you have to spend considerably less because you've been spending too much more. So from a household perspective like that, let's say that you owned a home that went up in value, and so that $1,000 a month, you're basically just covering with a home equity line of credit. But now all of a sudden you've reached the capacity of that limit, and you can't borrow any more money. Well, now your spending doesn't need to drop from $4,000 a month to $3,000 because you still have to pay back the debt. It's got to drop to maybe $2,500, maybe $2,000. So you're talking about potentially a 50% decrease in your costs. Well, look at what the federal government deficit is now. Are they going to reduce spending? Are they going to reduce the amount that retirees get in Social Security? No way. That's political suicide. And politicians don't care what they promise as long as they don't have to deliver it. So they promise something in the future, and then they're gone by the time it has to be delivered. I've seen this in companies, programs being rolled out. They can see stuff coming down the line. They don't tell anybody. Why? Because I'll be gone in 5 years before these problems start creeping up. So in government, it happens all the time. We'll promise. This is why Illinois is bankrupt as a state, because they promised great pensions to anybody and everybody that was in public service because they had huge public service unions. So to get the union vote, they had to make all these promises for benefits. So it's a buy for vote scheme, which is the same thing we're doing right now. I don't know how anyone can tell me that Donald Trump giving everybody $300 a month for unemployment isn't buying votes. I also don't understand how the House of Representatives saying we're going to give people $600 a month extra in unemployment benefits ongoing isn't buying votes, or offering universal basic income isn't buying votes. It's buying votes. That's what it is. So everyone's now buying votes, and this is what I'm saying. Capitalism is going to get blamed for this. This has nothing to do with capitalism. Capitalism would say, free markets would say, none of these things should exist. You can't make these future promises. They have to be realistic. You can't just offer everybody everything to get their vote right now. That should be illegal. And we should have laws against that specifically. There should be no way that those things are tied together. That all of a sudden, hey, promises. And that's the thing. It's been promise. It's the same thing with the homeowner, where you make $3,000 a month, you're spending $4,000, and everyone you're borrowing money from, I promise, we're going to pay it back. They haven't been forced to figure out how to make more money or to reduce their spending. They just keep making promises that they can't keep. And that's what the government's doing, making promises they can't keep. If you look at federal government, just what they say it is right now, $24 trillion of debt, and they collect $4 trillion a year. That means 8 years of no government spending to pay that money back. That's not happening. The government's not going to go into austerity. They will raise taxes, but they're going to increase spending. And if the Democrats take the whole thing, which they just might well do this fall, they're going to turn on that printing press like it's never been turned on before. So all of a sudden, we're going to have inflation. And I mean real inflation, like we haven't seen since the 1970s. And for those of us, including myself, who have not lived through a true depression because they've been kicked down the road. So the more the federal government gets involved, the more they just print money and push it out. And that keeps building these asset bubbles. And I'm going to go over what inflation really is on the next podcast where I talk about specifically government money printing and government interjection in the system. But there's inherent problems with all of this. So when you create these bubbles that the government has created, when you create things that are too big to fail, they still are going to fail. You've just made the problem that much bigger when they do. Instead of it deflating a balloon, it's now more like an explosion. So instead of saying, hey, we're going to put a pinhole in that balloon and slowly start deflating the air out of it, you make the thing so big that by the time it goes, it just pops. And it could very well do that. And in fact, I think it's going to. We had one of the fastest declines this year. And then right back on top of that, the fastest ever return from a decline back to a new high. All of those things happened so fast. So fast. 30% of market value wiped away in 2 weeks. All of that brought back and then some within a few months. Those are unprecedented fluctuations that are not going to end up good for us. That makes no sense. That's not a free market thriving. That is a contrived market with problems. So as the government prints money, we're going to have more inflation, which means if you're buying those government bonds, the amount of the negative real rate you're going to see is going to grow. So instead of it being you're getting 1%, losing 4 because you're collecting, because inflation's 5, inflation's going to be 10 and you're still going to get 1. And the government's going to put controls on things, on lots of things. And if you think they can't do that, then go study history. They already have. I say this all the time during the lockdowns. I believe these lockdowns are 100% illegal. The government does not have the authority in any way, shape, or form to prevent a business privately owned from opening its doors. However, they also should not and do not have the right to take a person against their will for which they've committed no crime and put them in an internment camp. But they did that to the Japanese Americans in the 1940s. And they're shutting down businesses now. They don't ask permission. It's the government. And they also control all of the military resources. And every time something bad happens in this country, they increase those. 9/11 happens. What'd they do? Blew the government up. Department of Homeland Security. Now we have all these people at airports preventing absolutely nothing, costing us all a ton of money, right? But also increasing the amount of military state that's in the United States. You may not think about it that way, but that is what's happening. They also put a lot more money into borders and border security and border patrol. Those people are all agents of the United States, right? You want to look back. Oh, we created laws against drugs. What did we create? What did we do? Oh, we drastically increased the size of the government. Why? Because we wanted the FBI to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And by I say we, I mean the real deep state. This is what's really going on in government. They want more and more and more and more of it. So they create more laws so they can grow themselves. This is part of the military-industrial complex that we were warned about that exists every day here. So we've got this huge increase in the FBI and the DEA and Homeland Security, all up in our business all the time. So when the government wants to deploy these things and do them, they have the resources behind them. They effectively have a military state to go do all this stuff for them. So they're going to do it. They're going to put controls on the market. They're going to prevent redemptions. They're going to prevent you from getting your money out of banks. And everyone goes, that couldn't happen here. It already has happened in the United States. Study your history. When the government gets itself so deep into debt, it's going to have to figure out its way out. Its way out is stealing it from its citizens. Inflation is a form of tax. It's a tax on your buying power, right? It's no different than saying, now what if they just raise sales tax 10% instead of taking your buying power away with printing money? Effectively, it's going to get to the same thing, except for in sales tax, they kind of have to be honest with it and tell you about it. With inflation, they just get to print more money, not tell you about it. No one runs on a campaign of, hey, we're going to raise inflation. We're going to print more money so your money's worth less than it was, so you lose your buying power. No politician says that. It's just what they do. And in the meantime, they're also raising frontline taxes, especially if you're in California. In California, they're going to raise real estate taxes. If there's a not a rev prog. That's my CPA head talking right there. RevProcs come from the IRS. No, there is a state referendum there that they're going to try and repeal. And that state referendum prevents the state from raising property taxes more than 1% on anybody. That leaves people in their houses, especially in a state like California where property values have risen so much. But the state doesn't like it because they can't collect enough in property taxes and just say your home's worth more and jack up the rate. But if they repeal that, that's exactly what they're going to do. I hope the citizens say no to that one. They're proposing to raise the income tax, the highest rate from 13.3, which is already a ludicrously high rate, to like 16.8. Now they're saying it's only going to be on people who make a certain amount of money. But here's the thing, and here's the other way that they tax more Americans, is when they have inflation, and let's just say all the inflation gets passed through, meaning that instead of you just losing your buying power, you make more money. So you go from making $30,000 a year to $60,000 a year, but your buying power is exactly the same because of inflation. Well, here's the other way they get you. When you were making $30,000 a year, you paid very little in taxes. Now that you make $60,000 a year, you're going to pay more in taxes. So while the buying power of your individual dollar might not have changed, your actual buying power and the amount of money you have left over after taxes has changed. It's another way that they slowly steal your money using taxes. So inflation is itself a tax. Inflating to tax more is also a tax. And if we raise inflation so that a pizza that now costs $20 then costs $40, and you have to pay tax on that, even if the tax rate's the same at 5%, when I paid 5% on my $20 pizza, that didn't cost me that much. Now I have to pay 5% on my $40 pizza. That's a whole different amount of money. So if the rates stay the same, but we increase everything in dollar nominal terms, then the government collects more and more and more money. And this is one of the ways that they just tax you. Now you go, hey, if all of that was the same, then the government's getting the same percentage of money. Yes, but that's not what really happens, because if inflation goes up 100%, you're not going to see 100% inflation in your wages. That's never the way that it works. You get 3 or 4% in wages. Meanwhile, the real rate's 10%. Meanwhile, your tax rate just went up. Meanwhile, your sales tax rate just went up. As a portion of the amount of money that you have left over to spend, your discretionary spending continues to go down. You get squeezed in buying power. And there's multiple ways the government can do this. Inflation's one of them. Inflation does so many layerings of this, though. And paying low rates and making you take a negative rate. And you go, well, they can't make me. Not today. But watch. Watch what happens with your retirement funds, where they're stuck and they go, those retirement funds have to buy U.S. Treasuries. Those U.S. Treasuries are paying 0.7% interest. Meanwhile, inflation is 10%. Guess what's happening to your retirement money? You're losing 9% of its value every single year. And in a decade, they've taken most of it. And this is what happens in the U.S. anyway. This is what's been happening. The value of the dollar has been dropping because they keep printing more money. And they're going to continue to print more money because that's the political feasible thing to do. So in future episodes, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about why they're going to keep printing money. And the last note that I have in here, which I guess I could discuss, which is this MMT. And here is the question. If MMT works, modern monetary theory works, where we can just print more money anytime we need it, then why do I have to pay any taxes at all? Why not just print money? And when you figure that one out, then I'm 100% on board with your MMT because you don't have to charge me any tax. However, I have serious concerns about the currency's longevity and how long people are going to realize that this money is not going to be worth much in a very short period of time. And that is my concern for the U.S. and for the Republic, is we're way too far down this road of crony capitalism where this is nonsense. This is not capitalism. These are not free markets. Don't let anyone tell you they are. And we need to separate the two right now, because capitalism is going to get blamed for all of this when capitalism is responsible for the prosperity and the politicians are responsible for the downturn. If we shrink our government, if we put them in charge of less decisions, because here's what I say all the time, show me the piece where the government does a fantastic job where you want them in charge of more things in your life. And that's the response usually. Crickets. No one has the thing where government does a great job for them. They're happy with the service. They're efficient. And they actually promote better business. Governments take from all of us. They take our time. They take our money. We should let them do less. They don't do good things with it. So the bigger we let them get, and this is what they're going to use this pandemic to do, increase the size of government even more. If the Democrats win this fall, I guarantee you we're going to see more and more growth of government, right? Because they're telling you they can save us all. They can prevent anyone from pain and harm. They can prevent a coronavirus. They can redistribute wealth perfectly and adequately so they can make reality of this idea that we're going to have the same economic output per person. We're going to have equality for all, right? This is nonsense. Government can't do this. We're not all born equal. We never have been. I step on the basketball court, I'm good. I step on the basketball court next to Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, not so good. I'm not 7 feet tall like Shaquille O'Neal. Life's not fair, right? But we do the best with what we have, and we're supposed to then help our neighbor. We are not supposed to live in a country where the government takes everything and controls the whole system, which is what they're moving towards more and more and more. And that's a bad thing for Americans, for our freedom, and for our country, and for a republic. So hopefully that resonates with most of you. Hopefully you pass this along. Hopefully we can create a conversation here where we're talking about the things that the government's doing that are bad, and maybe we figure out a way to prevent them from doing it and shrink our government instead of growing it. Now, I'm not so convinced that's going to happen. I believe that this is what it is and we're along for the ride, and therefore it's what can you do to protect yourself and your family from these things. If bonds are paying fractional, if the stock market's overvalued, what do we do? How do we protect ourselves and our families? And what strategies will work in the coming years that may not have worked in the last 40 years, but may work when there's a big recession or depression? And it's unfortunate we're headed down this path of depression, and it's unfortunate how long it's going to take us to get out of this. Even though the stock market says we're out now, we're not. It hasn't adjusted to reality. It's just adjusted to Fed money printing. That's not the reality of the world we live in, and sooner or later that bubble will also burst. And when it does, it's not going to be pretty. And you want to make sure you're protected on the other side of that. There's a few things that we can do. I've been learning about these things. I've been listening to a lot of smart people over the last month, trying to go back and study history and get my head wrapped around what's really going on, because none of the moves in the market make sense. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we have the highest stock market ever. Things don't make sense. So stay tuned, pay attention. Please pass this along. If you got questions for us, go ask them to us, email us, but please pass along, like and share on all the platforms. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.